This is the Life with Grief podcast, the podcast that talks about and normalizes the complexities of grief, life after loss, and all this entails, and so much more. I want you to think of this podcast as a safe space where I'm a friendly face and we're just journeying through this together to figure out how to live life with our grief in tow. I'm your host, Tara Accardo. I'm a grief and transformational life coach, and I'm here to serve you guidance, support, tangible coping tools, inspiration, and some laughs along the way to help you cultivate a more meaningful, intentional, and beautiful life. But grieving or not, we're getting into countless topics here on the podcast, from coping with loss to self-development and so much more. I'm so grateful you're here. Let's dive right in. Hello and welcome back to the Life with Grief podcast. I'm your host, Tara Accardo, and today I am joined by Dr. Sweta Vikram. She is a dedicated doctor of Ayurveda, a globally renowned leader, and an acclaimed author of 14 best-selling books. The goal of her work is to alleviate stress and elevate the overall quality of her clients' lives through Ayurveda-based health and wellness coaching. She specializes in addressing disordered sleep, anxiety, digestion, appetite, and mood. And these are all things that us grievers can really struggle with, right? So I am so excited for you to get to know her today. I was so excited to talk to her more about Ayurveda specifically because this practice was a key focus of mine as I was earning my soul purpose and transformational life coaching certification. And Ayurveda has truly been transformative, not only in coping with my grief and improving my overall health and well-being, but really in my own journey of finding my soul's purpose here and what I feel I'm meant to be doing after losing my parents to cancer and understanding how to move forward with our grief after we experience a devastating loss. It helped lead me to some major positive changes in my life, and I have no doubt it can open that door for you as well. But even more than the Ayurveda piece of the puzzle, we get into so many beautiful and inspiring topics today around grief, loss, and navigating life with grief in general that will leave you feeling so uplifted, I have no doubt. So with that all being said, let's get into it. I am so excited to get into this conversation today. Very, very unique guest here, and I'm so excited to tap into kind of just a topic that we haven't really gotten to explore on the podcast here yet today. So I want to just quickly welcome her and have her share a little bit about herself, and then we will get into all of the grief, the healing, the exploration of the grief evolution and all its complexities. But Dr. Vikram, welcome to the Life with Grief podcast.
Thank you so much, Tara, for having me on your podcast. This is really important work that you're doing, so I'm honored to be a part of it. And to everyone who's tuning in, listening, I know grief is different for everyone, so is the journey, but it's important to remember there is light at the end of the tunnel because nothing is forever. When grief hits us hard, it feels like, oh my God, this will never get better. But it's just important to remember maybe today that's how it feels and it's okay, but that's not how it'll always feel.
Yes. Thank you so much for starting off by saying that, because I think what you just said was just so beautifully said, because this space and even having like a social media platform in this space and everything is tricky sometimes, because there is this delicate balance between exactly what you said, which I think is so beautiful, but also like this toxic positivity that I feel like people sometimes feel like, oh, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it gets better and all that. Like, that's so hard for people to hear sometimes. But I've said this before in my own grieving journey, at least, and I'm sure you can empathize with this. And I definitely want you to elaborate on your journey and what you've been through. But, you know, earlier on, yes, that was difficult to hear, but I needed to hear that, if that makes sense,
Mm.
just to give me, just to know that that was out there, even if I didn't believe it at the time, even if I couldn't resonate with it in the moment because that felt so far away and so unrealistic. I think just hearing those things and knowing that we are and can carry our grief with us. It's not getting over it. It's not, moving on in such a black and white way. There are so many ways to do that. And that's why I really resonated with you and your mission and just like, alleviating whatever stress that we can and just elevating our overall quality of life through health and through wellness. And you have such a unique perspective on this that, like I said, we haven't spoken about on the podcast yet so far. So, and little spoiler alert, it's all about Ayurveda. Well, I'm sure there's more to you than just that, but it's a big part of the work that you do. And so I really want to get into that. But before we get there, I would love for you to just tell everyone just a little bit about you and who you are. And then I kind of like to get into your journey of loss and grief, which I understand can be very intertwined. Just the who we are, but I used to ask that question kind of separate. I was like, who are you outside of your grief and losses? And I was like, wait a second. It's actually can be very intertwined for many of us, or our grief and our loss has evolved and kind of led us to the work that we do. That is certainly my case, and I believe that's the case for you as well. So I'd love to
So
open it up to you, whatever you'd like to share with everyone.
sure, I'll do a brief intro, but I want to also address or rather acknowledge what you said so beautifully because I think grief transforms us. So much of the angst and anger, disappointment that we feel, it's not only from others because, people are complicated, each one of us,
Yeah.
right? And some people you don't think will be there, they just show up and they surprise you. And the people who you thought would hold your hands, they ghost you as if grief is a contagious disease, right? But I think in this journey, I've also realized we are transforming at the same rate.
Yeah.
Our identities change. So, for instance, I returned from India like less than a month ago, and I'm like, oh, that's the land of my ancestors. I no longer get to call it home. Home is just New York, and it sounds very robotic when I say it, but I had to spell that out for myself on a cellular level. That when I sat in the flight and flew back to New York, I was like, oh, of course I'll go back. I have loved ones still back there, but my parents don't live there any longer. So it's just, it's profound because yoga, Ayurveda are from India. So it's also the land of my ancestors. And I love visiting India, but I'll just see the place differently. And so that's the identity shift. Like there's no expectations, there's no anger, there's no detachment, there's non-attachment. So
Hmm.
grief is also changing it changes our identity in ways we didn't think we would be prepared for. So be
Yeah.
kind, just is
Yes.
what I'm trying to get to. So this is the book, The Loss That Binds Us. This is my latest, my 14th book, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, Tara and I, why I wrote this. But my name is Sweta Vikram. I am an author, an Ayurvedic doctor, speaker, and a grief educator. And my goal is always to help people, live a life on their own terms, live a life without excessive boundaries, whether it comes to health or, wellness, your diet, herbs, whatever have you. We live once. And to me, I believe when we get too rigid is when we break rules, and that's when we are face down in that pecan pie. That's when people are like chugging down 3 bottles of wine. Versus when we address our emotions, Tara, like, why do I want that second slice of cake? Why do I want that third helping? Why am I pouring myself like fourth glass of wine?
Yeah.
And that's what Ayurveda, it's getting to the root of the problem, not the symptoms. It's not one Friday, bad Friday at work. No, that third slice represents something else. And can we address that instead of like grief, shoving it under the couch and saying, Monday morning, I wake up, I'll be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Let's back up a little bit. So we were talking a little bit before we got started. And so in my certification to become a soul purpose coach, a life coach, I studied a little bit of Ayurveda, certainly not to the degree that you have. So I would love for you to just kind of let everyone here know, what is Ayurveda? Just like give a little bit of a background in case anybody here is not familiar with it. Yeah, let's just start there, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about how it can help us in the grieving process.
Absolutely. So simply put, it's a science of life.
Mm.
How we eat, how we live, how we engage socially, what news, television shows, books we consume, the company we keep, everything will impact your health and well-being. So literally, it's the science of life. It's much like Chinese medicine. There's an elemental system, and I won't get into the details of that. The other thing about Ayurveda, which I think is very important to know, is honors the circadian rhythm. So it's going back to basics. When you look at the birds, the sun sets, they go home. It's winter, animals retreat, they hibernate. Human beings, we go out again. We get that second wind, third wind. We're eating at midnight. We're parting till 3 in the morning. And
Yeah.
then we wonder. And again, there's no judgment. It's just an explanation of what circadian rhythm and honoring how we meant to live, what it means, and why Ayurveda is so beautiful in being preventative and
Yeah.
in working with maintenance, right? Before even somebody falls sick. It's because if we follow not everything, we live in today's day and age, we don't live inside caves, right? But even if we followed it to 70 to 80%, it can make a tremendous difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. Yeah. I think, and actually this segues perfectly kind of to my next question too, because I love Ayurveda so much because it's really just, we hear health and wellness and all of these like buzzwords out there nowadays, but it truly is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's just like healing uh, and the most not like simple way, but just the it's just taking care of ourselves on a cellular level from like the inside out and just making sure, and not in like an intimidating way, but just like that all of the aspects of our lives are nurtured and well taken care of. And I love so much what you said about asking, like almost being reflective and like, okay, why? So for example, like you mentioned, like, am I like, okay, that extra slice of pizza or an extra slice of cake or whatever. Not that it always has to be food related, but perfect examples.
Right.
And
It's
and
Friday.
sort of, yeah, yeah. And any of these like maybe I'm gonna say less, for lack of a better term, less than healthy habits that we might have, right? Kind of coming out of like, getting into the macro of it, like, okay, what is the why behind this? And just like getting curious about it and kind of just examining that and how we can just make some gentle shifts and changes and making sure everything is really in alignment. And I think certainly in my grieving journey, and I don't want to speak for you, but feel free to speak to this, is, grief really knocks us off our axis and really misaligns a lot of things in our life. And, this affects, I mean, countless aspects of our life, but our day-to-day, our routine activities that we might do, or things that maybe once brought us joy, or things that we once loved doing or something. Now we just like, we can't fathom doing it, or we can't listen to certain songs or go to certain places or whatever, maybe because it reminds us of our loved ones, or just there's so many complexities to grief and this process. So, talk to me a little bit about just grief and our sort of like daily routine, and maybe even how we can incorporate this Ayurvedic mindset, if you will, with it, because I think there's just such a beautiful mind body connection to be
Ab-
aware of.
Absolutely. And I love how you explained that whole process because, yes, grief is an individual journey, but it knocks us all out in
Yeah.
different ways. And I think that's where I found the power of Ayurveda, literally the power of Ayurveda, so astounding. Because, some people, I'm very high pitta. For those of you who don't know, that's fire and water elements. So think leaders of the world, speakers of the world, orators of the world, also in out of balance, the killers of the world, right? So pitta is a really
Mm.
sharp-minded, sharp tongue. So everything in balance can be beautiful. You can do
Yeah.
so much good in the world. But when it comes out of balance, goes out of balance, that's when the God complex and narcissism starts, right? So
Yeah.
pittas really can take charge. So in moments of grief, people would ask me, how are you so under control? Like we had two deaths back to back, my father, my father-in-law, both unexpected inside of 2 days. And when my mom's ninth death anniversary was like 1 day away.
Yeah.
And I'm like the youngest of the lot, and all of that is going on. And it's like, how are you so put together? Firstly, I'm like, this is an awkward question because this is not a movie release where I have to be put together. This is crisis.
Yeah.
But then in reflection, but that's also the pitta being reactive. Like, what do you mean? But in reflection, when I came back and I realized that was my pitta in balance. It's the doer.
Yeah.
It's being able to show up, being very focused on what needs to done, what's priority, really knowing how to like work on my emotions. That strong personality, right? But then there were people, and it doesn't make me special. This is just a pitta balance
Yeah.
person. But had I been out of balance, I would have been screaming at people. My grief would have been anger. My grief would
Yeah.
have been criticism. My grief would have been judgment. And this is why the Ayurvedic practices help so much because I had to remind myself, not that I wanted to, that I need to continue with my practices. Me not taking care of myself will not bring anyone back. If anything, if it makes me sicker, what a way to dishonor my loved ones. But that's
Yeah.
my mindset, right? I
Yeah.
had a woman, Tara, who came to my event and she was like, when I lost my mom for 2 weeks straight, I was just eating cake. And I was like, and that's okay too. You
Yeah.
were aware after 2 weeks you did something. If you
Yes.
continue to make that a lifestyle thing, that's when I would be concerned.
Sure.
Everybody functions differently. I wasn't so acutely intentional or mindful 10 years ago when my mom passed away.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think time also teaches us, and also from an Ayurvedic perspective, for those who have a Vata imbalance, might just be anxious. They don't know how to shut their mind, right? People call them their scatterbrain. It's not them. They just cannot, they don't know how to manage their energy. It's just an imbalance. But one imbalance, they are creative, they're spiritual, they're the people who are impromptu. Same thing with kaphas. They
Yeah.
are your 2 a.m. phone call friends, right? They are the ones who'll keep the family together. So, and when you're grieving, they're the people like, we'll cook for your family and bring. But when they're out of balance, they don't want to leave the couch. They're the ones sitting with a pint
Yeah.
of ice cream, the cake. This person was a kapha. And in my hand, that's how I see people. I was like, yeah, that's the kapha talking, right? Like 2 weeks, I don't want to leave the cake. It's that attachment. So out
Yeah.
of that. So I think Ayurveda really humanizes the grieving experience because human
Yes.
nature is to always compare and compete. And it is pitiful. That's the only word that I have because we shouldn't have that hierarchy. We are all of us are trying to do our best to survive the loss and grief. Because
Yes.
in that moment, it feels, oh my God, what am I doing here? And it's not in a hurtful way that I don't want to be here. It's like, what am I doing here? What are so many awful people on this planet doing here when my loved ones are gone?
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Just to back up a little bit, because so these are the doshas, correct, that you
The
were
doshas, yeah.
referring
The
to?
Vata Pitta Kapha.
Yes, please. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because that the people that I one-on-one coach, we get more into that. But for anybody here who's not familiar with the doshas, can you just explain just really quick, like what each one is? Because I heard you referring to them and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good for people to be aware of. But for people who aren't familiar with Ayurveda, they might be like, wait, what? One of the things that I know I studied was like the qualities sort of each one. So like when they're at their best, they look like this. And when, because you kind of mentioned like if they're at their worst, this kind of might happen. So
Right,
maybe just
right.
high level explaining that.
Absolutely. So there are five elements, like I talked about earlier: earth, ether, earth, fire, water, and space, right? So Vata dosha is a combination of ether and air. So these people, when they're in balance, they are clairvoyant. They can be. I'm not saying everyone
Yeah.
is. The ones who seek spirituality, because there is an openness. Think space, it's open.
Mhm.
Think air, there is lightness, right?
Yeah.
But, and like oftentimes very creative, all of that, night owls. But when they go out of balance, that too much energy can create anxiety,
Mm.
right? So there's too much
Mhm.
upward energy. So they're the people like, I can't sit in the subway, I can't take the train. Or what is happening? And if you tell them these are the five things you need to do to bring to the funeral home, they're like, what do you mean? What is a funeral home? And oftentimes people will tell them, calm down. Trust me, if somebody could calm down, they would. No one likes to feel riled up. So that's the
Sure.
worst thing to say.
Mhm.
Pittas, I gave an example. It's fire and water. So in balance, they are the doers. You're really loyal people. Stable, get first ones to get burnt out because they're very intense. But out of balance, they can be very critical and sharp. They're very bright when it comes to the mind, extremely bright. But the
Mhm.
brightness is and the sharpness is not just the brain, it's also the tongue. So pittas constantly need to balance because they're the ones, oh, look at that. Or the drunk uncle at a wedding, that's your pitta, right? Or even at a funeral, oh, the potato salad wasn't good, that's your pitta.
Yes. Right.
So and then the kaphas, it's earth. So when I say kapha, say I slow down. Earth and water. Think of dough, think of pizza dough, think of bread, think of samosas. All of that has that earth and water. So it's
Yeah.
stable. Kaphas give us stability in our relationships, in life. They nurture us. They are the ones who'll open their arms, open their homes, invite you in. But when they are out of balance, they're very clingy. They're
Mm.
very excessively attached. They hoard emotion. So they hoard. So what does that mean? So depression. Very often from an Ayurvedic perspective, kapha is like that downward energy, right? Like that heavy. And depression is heavy. Depression is never this. This is anxiety. Depression is
Right.
often this. So then with pitta, there could be that anger issues, the burnout issues. So with
Mm.
kaphas, again, when they go out of balance, they are the ones who will be over attached. And I'll give you an example. My mom told me about this woman she knew. whose father, and that's my mom's generation, right? When her father died, she kept all of his shoes and almost created like a museum at home. Now, that is your kapha imbalance. It's
Mm,
okay to grieve, but we don't need to save 60 pairs of shoes and put it up in the living room and create a museum. Excessive attachment, hoarding, that's your kapha. So just
yeah.
important tips to, just sort of identify what's going on during the grieving process, because I think grief makes a monster out of all of us. We are all just trying to cope, right? But if
Yeah.
we have these tools, at least we don't judge others.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining all of those because I think, and there might even be some listeners here where they're kind of like, how do I know which one I am? And I think it's important to mention too, and you again, you can speak to this, like we can go in and out of each of those like phases, so to speak, throughout our lives, right? Like I think there's a misconception where we're like one or the other or whatever. And it's like, no. And there are ways where we can like get out of one, so to speak, and into another. And it's, you correct me if
So I
I'm
would
wrong, but
say yes and no. So
okay,
your
yeah, explain that.
constitution, basic constitution doesn't change. So
Okay.
at the time of conception, the mother's dominant dosha and the dad's dominant dosha, they come together, and that becomes your prakriti or constitution. That's
Oh,
what it's
okay.
called. Yeah. But the more we go off balance is when we get into imbalance. So for instance, I am a pitta kapha, but I might get into a vata. So my propensity is to have a higher pitta imbalance. Summer is coming, so I have to be very careful with how I live.
Gotcha.
Spring season can lead to congestion in my body and weight gain. That's typical kapha problems. I very rarely will endure vata problems. Doesn't mean I won't. I rarely, because I have little vata, but come fall season, I do have a little bit of like sleep issues. It takes me a little while because vata will create sleeplessness. New York City is very windy and I love to walk, and that wind goes through my bones, increases vata. So, but for somebody who is high vata, they'll deal with that a lot more than I would. So the imbalance, the whole point is if we are here and we keep going this way, we're
Yeah.
getting into imbalance. You just want to come back to balance, because in Ayurveda, there's 6 stages to a disease. And if we can keep coming back to that first stage, then we don't get into a disease format.
Mm, okay. That's oh beautiful. That's so it's so good to be aware of. And I again, like I know it's hard to know which way is up when we're grieving, let alone be aware of some of these things. So I always caution, with anything, of course, anything we talk about here on the podcast, like just being very aware of where you are at in your grief and just understanding that anything that we mention here, it's like, okay, maybe just keep it in the back of your mind for later if we're not like understanding it or quite open to it yet. But I'd love to ask you if people here are aware that they're maybe feeling an imbalance, whether it's a mind body imbalance or just like some imbalances in their life, which of course they're probably like, yeah, hi, I'm grieving. I'm like all over the place. I'm not balanced at all. I'm like out here in the ocean on some raft by myself. What's maybe just like some high level recommendations or tools or just things that people can just very easily be aware of to help themselves feel just a little bit more in balance?
Absolutely. So the suggestion that I'll make is tridoshic, which is applicable to all doshas. And I just want to resonate with what Tara said. If you're going to make any changes, always speak with an Ayurvedic doctor first, because medicine for one can be poison for the other. Nectar for one can be poison for the other. So, and you touched about gunas and qualities. And so even within a pitta, what gunas are high? We need to work on those gunas, and that only an Ayurvedic doctor will be able to help you. So please do not experiment on yourself,
Mhm.
which is extremely, extremely important. But having said that, Ayurveda is the best form of self care. And it's one of my favorite reasons, because Ayurveda will remind you if you have to honor your innate nature. You
Yeah.
have to, and
Oh,
self care
thank you for
needs
saying that.
absolutely, and self care should be accessible and affordable.
Yeah.
And during grieving, especially, people are like, go away on vacation, unless you've dealt with what's really gnawing at you and clawing at you. Even on vacation, you're going to pour that extra glass, eat that extra slice, and not deal with the situation. So get to what's bothering you, and
Yeah.
don't let other people's barometer judge you. Like I said, I'm pitta, so my anger is not violent. It's an acknowledged anger. Like for me, it's self-righteousness,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
So I'll be like, like my parents, I overextend myself. So when certain people didn't show up, I was angry. And I
Mhm.
wasn't just angry at them, I was angry at myself. Why didn't I see the signs, right? Or
Yeah.
why did my parents enable their behavior? So instead of judging like, oh, because in our house, my husband and I were grieving, his sister, my brother, all of us are grieving. I never said, oh, he doesn't react this way, he doesn't, or she doesn't react that way. We are all unique and special. And
Yes.
this anger, this passion also fuels my life, my career, and my relationship. So every time that your mind goes to, but this one is not grieving like that, just remind yourself you are special and you are exactly where you need to be. Right. So A, no comparison, no hierarchy, no competition.
Yeah.
B, it's going to be really, really difficult. But no matter your dosha or doshic imbalance, stick to a routine to the extent possible. You might not
Mm.
want to shower, you might not want to exercise, but give your brain a spin, right? Because the mind tries to control us. So I would tell myself because with I was shuttling between two cities, two ICUs for 10 days. So
Yeah.
there was no gym or yoga. I did meditate in the Uber when I was doing that car ride, but I
Mm.
would climb up 11 floors because I was like, it's not just good for my heart health, it's also releasing stress. It's my
Yes.
only alone time because I need to
Mm.
process this outside of others. I'm grateful for others, but who am I in the scheme of things? What am I, Shweta, the daughter-in-law, feeling? And the only way to get that space was to take the stairs. People thought I was nuts. In like that heat, I was taking the stairs, but I was like, it's my mental health. You don't get it.
Yeah. It's my me
So,
time.
so yeah, it's my me time. So, find and don't feel guilty. You might feel guilty, but don't feel guilty about it. Whatever it is, even if it's 10 minutes. And then even as you start returning to life, whatever your new normal looks like,
Mm.
some people just jump into work. Some people, again, if they're kapha, the heaviness will stick around, right? Everyone's process is different. And just because someone is talking about it for 2 years doesn't mean they love their person more than you did. It
Yes.
comes
Yeah.
back to that, stay true to who you are. We
Yeah.
all show love in different ways, we all grieve in different ways, and it's very, very important to hold space for different kinds of grief. And like, in unfortunately, may this never happen to anyone. Like in our home, my husband is an internal processor, I'm an external processor. And day one, I said to him, he was very close to my dad, and I was very fond of my father-in-law. I was like, if you say that, oh, I miss your dad. Cricket matches happen. And right now, World Cup cricket was happening in New York. My husband, a year later, Tara, was like, he almost picked up the phone to call my dad to tell him, hey, we're going to go watch the game.
Oh,
And I was like, I never want that situation where I say to you, or situations reverse, you say to me, oh, if you're feeling bad, imagine how bad I feel. That was my dad. No, no
yeah.
comparison, even in the relationship. So keep it simple. People will try to convolute it more than anybody else. Your mind will. But
Yeah.
just remember, it feels tight and ugly and like there is no light. And we all learn how to survive in our own ways. And there's no right or wrong way. We all learn how to survive.
Yes. Oh my gosh, beautifully said. There's so many things. I was just like, preach. Yes, this is like lighting me up in so many ways. So many, so many amazing things you just touched on there. And I think, oh my gosh, where do I start? I mean, just I, unmet expectations is so difficult in grief because I've been there. I've talked about it on the podcast before where, we might have expected people to react a certain way or the same way that we did, or we're surprised that someone is or isn't reacting the way that we want them to or supporting us in the way that we want to. And so what you said about just honoring the uniqueness of all of us, and we are all made up of different doshas, right? And our sort of our archetypes are very different, whereas some of us might be more outwardly with how we express ourselves or not, and some might it can just look so different. And that was one of the biggest lessons for me personally as
Mm.
I was understanding my grief and as I was experiencing it truly for the first time. Like I had lost loved ones before, but never someone as close to me as a parent, right? That I am connected to in this cellular way.
Right.
And, it's so hard when life feels like it's moving on and people are going back to work and things as if nothing happened. People stop checking on you or they don't check as often, or they might see things that you post on social media and they're just like, oh, wow, they look like they're doing really well. Whereas,
Mm-hmm.
but we can still be dealing with a lot inside and some people they don't know. So yeah, I think it's just such an important lesson in being gentle with ourselves and with others. And one thing I know that you are a big proponent of is, practicing patience and self-compassion, but also this therapeutic value in having, I don't want to say having humor in a time of sorrow, but just like acknowledging that that is there. Can you just talk to us a little bit about that? Because I know some people, depending on where they are in their grieving journey, might be like, I have no humor in me. I don't want to laugh. I feel guilty laughing. And they just don't, that's just not their reality for them right now. But can you just talk to us a little bit about that? Just again, practicing patience for ourselves and that self-compassion, but also the value in seeing sort of like the light in the tunnel that you talked about earlier, and just the value of humor and still
Oh,
tapping into that when we
absolutely.
can.
I'll start with the humor bit because my brother and I get my dad's dark humor. In fact, an article of mine just came out yesterday, and that's something, on Father's Day. And I was like, that's one of the biggest gifts my dad has given my brother and I, aside from a love of life, food, people, it's dark humor. Because
Yeah.
even when we had these deaths one by one, and there was one day in between, both my brother and I look at it, oh, so fill in the blank, who's going now? And this is like between deaths, and everybody laughed. And I'm like, you know
Yeah.
what? People smile. That doesn't mean you love the person any less. Oh my God, my dad must have been so proud and happy that we laughed.
Yeah.
So and it might not be your thing, and that's okay too. And it
Yeah.
goes back to the point of self compassion. If humor is not your thing, it's not leaving you. It's okay.
Yeah.
One day you'll find something funny, and grief doesn't need to be always heavy. Sometimes you also be mad, like, oh my God, did you really do that, dad or mom or whoever it's that you've lost? So always keep coming back to self compassion. But even the patience bit, Tara, I believe it
Mhm.
starts with self. So, one thing I wanted to add on what you were saying, because it's been 10 years since my mom passed away, a year since my dad and my father in law, the disappointment and the anger that I had and the shock at how some people gaslighted us over a period of time, I'm realizing some people have their stuff going on and they just don't like to share, so we don't know what's
Yeah.
happening. A lot of people don't share the same relationship with their siblings, their partners, their children. So
Mhm.
there's also this jealousy that I will never have that. The kind you're doing a podcast talking about someone you miss and you're grieving over. I've written a book about it, right?
Yep.
Large
Yep.
majority doesn't get that. And while grief is the price we pay for love, what a privilege to have loved.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't know whose stories, what people have difficult relationships with their family members, people are
Yes.
estranged. It's different kind of. So I started to identify a lot of the people who just completely took me by surprise. But did they really? There was
Mhm.
always that little bit of thing which they knew, like my brother and I really doted on our parents. And it
Yeah.
just so happened my sister-in-law and my husband did too.
Yeah.
So, and we have that relationship with our families where they are parents. They don't have to be foolproof. Neither are we, but they are our parents. And that's it. It's simple. They don't have that with their children. So
Yeah.
their absence is their jealousy. So if you're
Ooh.
patient with yourself, you realize that, oh, honey, it's all about them. It's got nothing to do with you. I know people who've treated grief as contagious
Yes.
and abandon people. And then I realized, because a lot of my work is around mental well-being from an Ayurvedic perspective. They are
Mhm.
so scared, and I'm not justifying any bad behavior. It
Sure.
just
Sure.
made me feel better about myself. Like, no, it's on them. They are
Yeah.
so scared of dying. They feel like if they talk to someone who's lost someone, they'll die. And I'm like,
Yeah.
how unfortunately stupid are you?
Yeah.
Because you'll have just fewer people crying at your funeral if you break hearts. So
Wow.
you, right?
Ooh. Hey, my friend, are you needing some relief from your grief? If so, I have an exciting new offering that will help you get exactly that. My 14-day Relief in Your Grief challenge brings you powerful, impactful, bite-sized daily content alongside the perfect meditation. One of the biggest struggles I hear from my members, clients, and people on social media is that they just need some relief from the stress, sadness, and pain that grief and loss can cause. But here's the thing, so many people are lost and unsure about where to start. This can feel like a huge thing to tackle, so we are doing it together and we're starting with just 14 days. Give me 2 weeks and I will help you begin to take that anxiety, heartache, and anguish and turn it into peace, clarity, and hope as you move forward with your grief. Seriously, what do you have to lose by joining? Challenge your grief and give yourself some relief, my friend. I have no doubt this 14 days will be an inspiring, uplifting, perspective changing experience for you. Join now through the link in the show description.
It's like if you can't build a life when you're alive, you're thinking about a life when no one has control over. You're
Yeah.
just breaking hearts and no one really cares about you. But again, in patience and self compassion, I realized again, not me, them. So that
Yes.
anger was justified. It explained the bad behavior, and truth has a way of revealing itself.
Mm-hmm.
So the same people who hurt me had hurt other people in the family. They started talking to me. I was like, I don't want to bring this up because mine is very raw. I don't have a perspective right now. I'm just
Yeah.
angry about that. But they started to share, and I was like, oh, it's the same person. That's true of every family, every friend circle. Like, if you're patient with yourself, people's bad behavior reveals a lot about them and it teaches you a
Yes.
lesson. But also, it creates space. Think of it. If
Yeah.
you don't have to care for 500 people, if you just have to care for 50 people, you and I can do a podcast interview right now
Yeah.
because the connections we have are the authentic connections. And I
Yeah.
think that's the other power of grief. When you're patient and self compassionate, you start really creating space by letting go of who and what doesn't serve you. And it's hurtful at the
Yes.
start, it's never easy. It's
Yeah.
never easy. But again, just it's the word choice that, and I love that, that patience and self compassion. It's
Yeah.
okay. You are going through, when I was in Singapore, I love nature and animals. So I said to my brother, I want to see pandas because,
Yes. Those are my
Singapore has
favorite animals.
pandas. I know, right? They have sanctuaries and they're not zoos. So animals are treated with a lot of love. And then
Yes.
there was an anaconda. It was shedding its skin and the fish was pulling that skin. It was very poetically creepy. And these, and I was like, grief is that's what the new
Mm.
people, the old people help us de-skin and they
Ooh.
go away with that. And when the new skin shows up, there are new people who are attracted to our inner light.
Oh, that is a beautifully twisted like analogy for that. I love it though. That I've never heard someone really say that in that way where we've talked about this, right? Your grief transforms you, but it truly does give you metaphorically speaking this new skin because you really and you nailed this too, and I can really empathize with this in my own way through my own journey. Like you realize who is there for you and who is not, and who passes judgment. And so, boundaries for sure, I think are
Mm,
a big part of grief and the grieving process. And I've said this before in previous episodes, not that we need to like, kick people out of our lives per se, but what you just said is I couldn't have said it better, is we just realize and have to take stock of who is adding value to our life and perhaps who is not. And then just and be able to navigate that. And I can certainly say for myself there are some people that I had to not cut out. It wasn't so black and white, but I just had to really reevaluate my
yes.
relationship with them and how I interacted with them, or maybe not, or maybe it was somebody that I was like, no, this is actually quite toxic, this is adding no value to my life, but also what value can I add to their life too? Like it's a two-way street. I certainly,
Absolutely.
in grief can make us very, I don't want to say selfish, that's not the right word, but it can just make us very like, this is happening to me.
Yeah.
So how are people helping me? How am I getting the help I need? And that's important, of course, to have that self-care and self-love for ourselves. But, coming also from a place of service. And I think you can speak to this too. Like h- grief does many things, but I think it helps us, understand like, okay, how can we turn that around and be a better support system for other people? How can we now be perhaps more empathetic and more compassionate and be a better supporter? And that does not come right away. I certainly, in my experience at least, that did not come right away. I had realized actually, like, wow, I really could have shown up for people in a different or just a better way. And having grace for ourselves as we do that. You don't know what you don't know. So until you go through it, like, it's
Like,
really easy to say, it's not as easy to do, but it's such an important part of the learning process. And, I know
absolutely.
some people get a bit triggered when they're just like, let's find meaning in your loss. And it's like, it's not, I would love your perspective on this actually. I don't know that it's meaning so much in the loss itself, but it's like, it's bigger than that. It's a little bit bigger picture. So it's not so much like, let's not get hung up on the meaning of the death of this specific person. It's,
Mhm.
how has this affected your entire being, perhaps your soul's journey, your soul's purpose here? And that is certainly why I've gotten into the work that I have. But if I'm understanding correctly, it kind of is why you've written your most recent book, which I'd love to get to in a second. And it's not like we're doing these things in spite of who we've lost or something, but it's just, it has shifted our perspective and perhaps the trajectory of our life, quite literally. So talk to me a little bit, just I'd love your thoughts on that. And then I would love to also get into your book as well.
Uh, Absolutely. And I think one of the big takeaways for me from grief this time around, 10 years later, like 9 years later, losing dad and 10th now, is being self reliant.
Yes.
Because, when you lose both your parents at a relatively younger age, and
Mm.
and I don't know what young and old is, because I think a friend of mine
All
who is,
relative, right?
it's all relative. And I say this specifically because a friend of mine, my dad passed away in his 70s, mom in her 60s. So
Mhm.
fairly young, right? And then my friend's mom passed away at 101, at
Mm.
101, and she was fully abled. And I was like, that is just as big a loss. Number has
Yes.
nothing to do with it. But
Yep.
it
Can't
also made
compare.
me realize, Tara, that nothing more important than self-reliance. Because my
Yes.
husband would say something. I went to a boarding school. I'm an extrovert. I grew up with like a lot of people, family, all of that stuff, despite my parents living in Africa for like many, many years. It's just the kind of family that I was raised by, very close to people. My husband would always say, like, everything is transient. And I never accepted it, not even
Mm.
9 years until my mom passed. It was only after my dad passed away. Because when mom passed away, I still had dad. So I was seeing the world through his eyes, and I felt sort of protected. And I still had that space of unconditional love, that safe space where I would show up. When I really needed people, people had their own stuff going on.
Mhm.
Everything that we've talked about. So I realized the lighter you want to feel in your grief journey, the more you have to work on yourself. And I loved the way you said about, who we become. For me, I've always been a dancer. I used to be a choreographer in college. I've done traditional Indian classical, I've done hip hop and belly dancing, like
Oh, that's
all of that.
amazing.
But then I kind of stopped, aside from weddings or parties, like I stopped dancing in these 10 years between losing mom and dad.
Mm.
And for Memorial Day, we were in Texas at a friend's son's high school graduation. It was a big, Indians really party hard. So we were 120 of us on the dance floor. And I realized that night I didn't stop for 4.5 hours. And so for me, my reincarnation happened around Memorial Day. I'm like, this part of Shweta needs to come back. And for this part of Shweta to come back is when the lightness in Shweta comes out. So if
Wow.
you're honest with your grieving process, there are things you will find. But at the same time, I used to play the piano, and I stopped after my mom passed away, and I
Mm.
still don't want to go back to it. So I'm like,
Mhm.
that part can stay wherever she is,
Yeah.
but go back to being authentic with your processes.
Yeah. I love that how you just said that. Like, that can stay where she is, and you are giving yourself that permission to be like, okay, that might be over. Maybe not forever. Maybe in 10 years you'll pick it up again.
Yeah,
Who knows?
but don't
Yeah,
put so much thought into it.
it's so much, I feel like, of the grieving journey is what feels good. Like, overall, in the moment, in the small quiet moments, but also like long term too, because it is a process that does not end, and
Right.
we carry it differently. It starts to look different, it evolves. As you said, you kind of find the light at the end of the tunnel makes itself known somewhere. Because I always joke, like,
Right.
sometimes we can't even find the tunnel, but eventually, with time, not that time heals all wounds per se, but I think you've said this beautifully throughout this episode, is like, to find that light, like, that's where the working on yourself comes in. But, and I know when people are just like, oh, I have to work on myself, like, oh my God, that sounds exhausting. It doesn't have to be, because I just love this idea of you're coming back to sort of your truest self, or maybe you're unlocking these aspects and parts of yourself and your soul that you never even knew before. And that process can actually be really exciting and very cathartic and very healing at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And I feel, Tara, like for most of us human beings, right? The wiser we get, the more experience and deeper we get into a spiritual journey, we might talk more about it. Reality is everyone seeks validation. Somebody
Mhm.
might seek it 2%, for others, it might be 200%. I read something beautiful on Instagram recently. There's an account by the name of Holistic Psychologist, and she
Mhm.
wrote something about, like, and I'm paraphrasing whatever she said, but the idea of not constantly seeking advice, because that leads you to closer to your truer self.
Yes.
But also, when we make mistakes is how we learn. And I think something that I've learned in the recent past is to, even your partner, however supportive they are, then you don't want to disappoint them. Your
Yeah.
parents, your siblings, your friends are like, no, come back to who you are. What would Tara want in this moment?
Yes.
Screw what anybody else thinks. What would you want? And if you're a decent human being, we don't want bad things. But in
Yeah.
this moment, if a lemonade is what you want, or pecan pie is what you want, like, sure, where is that coming from? And to me, dancing, that was the answer. Like, I have missed out on joy because I wasn't dancing. I am the happiest not when I'm writing or doing yoga, but when
Yeah.
I'm dancing. And in my journey, for some reason, because I got so intensely, and this is my cautionary warning to everyone, you take on a new path, it's great, go all in, but also have little points of joy in your life. Like, everything doesn't need to be intense, right?
Yes.
Just because your work is intense doesn't mean you need to be intense. And like for
Mhm.
me, dancing is that spark. The work is very intense. I had clients this morning, and I'm dealing with the health issues, mental health, but I turn on the music 20 minutes, it's all left my body. So find those sparks of joy, and you have to do the work. You can talk to Tara, you can talk to me, you can talk to a therapist. Everyone will tell you the same thing. We can give you suggestions, but if you don't do the work, nothing will shift.
Yes. Yes. I literally this morning I was working with a client and I was like, she was laughing. She was like, yeah, I listen to, these podcasts and a lot of it has always been like self-help. And, I'm like, she was like, I was looking for people to tell me what to do. I was like, you tell you what to do. I can't sit here and tell you. We can maybe ask questions and ask thought-provoking questions. Like, that is my job, at least simply as a coach, is to help you get there on your own, because the answers are within you. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Your
Right.
intuition, but that's where I feel like so many of us get blocked. Grief can certainly block us, but even just life in general can can block us from so many aspects of life. And I understand how it happens. So again, we give grace always. But it really is coming back, like we've been saying, to the essence of you. And I love what you said about just, either seeking advice or always trying to take other people's advice. And there's so much advice from podcasts, from social media, and all of these things. And I've done it myself, which is why I feel I can speak to this. We can get very inundated and it almost makes us more overwhelmed, because we're like, oh, well, now I feel like I need to try this, or I want to try that. And again, I know the irony that I have a podcast of like, here's all these coping tools to try, but it's more presenting it like, this is just something. Feel free to try it, explore it, see how it feels. If it doesn't resonate, maybe never come back to it, or come back to it later. Just know it's here for you. And I've said it before, like, what worked for me now was not what worked for me early on in my grieving journey. I'm sure that's true for you. It's true for many of us, because that evolves with time, and grief or not, we're ever evolving anyway. So it's such a fascinating process. I just love to encourage people to get curious about it, and get curious about themselves, and tap into their intuition again, because that is like such an important piece of the puzzle.
Love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just to start wrapping this up, I really would love for you to just tell us a little bit more specifically about your book, how you came to write it, and then also, yes, it's called The Loss That Binds Us. And tell us a little bit, like, what sparked this for you, how you came to write it, and then what people can find in the book and why it's a valuable resource.
So, I've talked about like all these losses that happened last year. And when we came back to New York, my dad, sorry, wanted me to write a book about loss and grief.
Mm,
I was very, very close to him. And he would always say that, like, people need to normalize grief. It's a part of life. People don't deal with it. They eat their way through it, they drink their way through it. There are other ways of how we can self-harming habits.
yep.
Um, but they don't want to talk about it. It's almost like a taboo. And people are so uncomfortable. Unless you're talking about highlighted reels of your life, people are uncomfortable. But
Hmm.
that's not life. The other thing was when I was looking at, fortunately for me, I was in my doctorate program. I had mentors, I had colleagues, I had access to these healing modalities that worked, or at least, worked for me and spoke to me. I realized everything was from the other end of, now I've healed, here is what you can do. But no one was telling me, I feel like crap right now, and that's okay. Or
Mm,
this is how you might feel, and that's okay. Because again, unless that toxic positivity that you talked about,
yeah.
like people want to, they don't want to, and I don't fault anyone. It's the world we live in.
Yeah.
The fear of people, the cancel culture, or
Oh,
people saying, I don't want to work with you. But grief is so raw. You don't know how it'll show up. No one can prepare you for how grief shows up. My grief showed up so differently the first time when I lost mom and then when I lost dad. It was very, very different. So I think there were all of these reasons. I was like, where is a simple digest of digestible information? Like, I'm
mhm.
feeling angry today. Like a friend of mine said, she's Jewish, but her best friend is Catholic. And so she's like, every year for Christmas, she invites me over. And I love her for doing that. But my friend lost her parents even before she got married. So she's like, every time I'm there, there's a little bit of envy that I'll never have that family. And I
Yeah.
was like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's not like you're hurting her parents, but
Yeah.
denying yourself that feeling is being untrue to yourself. And that becomes a disease eventually,
Mm,
staying away from authentic selves, right?
yes.
Uh, because from an Ayurvedic perspective, 80% of the diseases start from the mind.
Real quick interruption here, and then we'll get back to this episode. If you're someone who is experiencing some form of loss and are trying to navigate the complexities of grief, which you likely are in some capacity if you've stumbled upon this podcast, then this message is for you. If you haven't heard about my Life with Grief membership and community yet, this is truly something you need to check out. This membership is here to guide you into living a deeper, more meaningful, and full life after experiencing loss. Who doesn't want that, right? I created this membership because I know what it's like to navigate and cope with grief on a daily basis, and I know the tools and support it takes to do this effectively. I've done the work myself, and I've coached people just like you to do the same. It comes down to having impactful, effective resources and tools at your disposal, having the right support around you from people who can understand and empathize with your grief, and having encouragement and inspiration around you consistently to not only elicit and spark change, but to keep it and keep the positive momentum going. Enrollment opens once a month for a limited time. Check out the details linked in the description, and I hope to see you in there.
So I all of these aspects, yes. And then also, how do we honor those who have passed away?
Mm-hmm.
How do we keep their memories alive? How, like, what to do? And this is what worked for me, but do what works for you. But these are these guidelines, these tools that worked for me. And productivity was my healing. It might not be for others. So find a balance. Don't burn yourself out, but don't be a couch potato either. And I wanted a book that helped people go through that journey of grief instead of me saying, well, people, I grieved and I did well. Here is a book for you.
Yep.
No, grief can bring out that dark side. And I really address that in the book. Like, it'll bring out jealousy, it'll bring out anger, it'll bring out envy. One of my friends who lost her mom when we were 13 last week confessed to me, she was like, it's only after I read your book, can I say this to you? And we've known each other forever, that I still get jealous when, I see full families. And I was like, why are you surprised? If your feelings don't hurt anybody else, that's okay. The
Yeah.
people who say, I am not impacted, that's a whole lot of BS, because when you've lost somebody you love, you will be impacted. And that's okay
Absolutely.
too. And it's like a Father's Day is coming up for those of us who don't have fathers, or for those who've lost their sons or are in estranged relationships, any of those difficult relationships, Sunday is going to be difficult. But
Yeah.
no, Monday will come and we'll forget about, then we need to worry about this a year later. So
Yeah.
just also, I wanted people to know that everything is transient. Relationships, emotions, and I don't mean to be shallow about relationships, but
Hmm.
I've realized in relying on myself and accepting if I am ever evolving, so are people, so are relationships. I wanted a book to say that that's you're not a bad person, somebody is not a bad person. Yes, the world has some not so happy people and they will lash out on you in different ways, but a large majority is just struggling to stay alive. That's
Yeah.
what it is. Like their day to day,
Survival.
don't know what's going on. So it's a simple book with 108 tips, because 108 is an auspicious number across different religions and cultures, especially the world of yoga. And
Hmm.
I wanted people to have like those bite-sized things where, they go to a section of the book. Hey, it's Father's Day. What do I do? And I'm like, okay,
Yes.
light up a candle, cook their favorite meal. But a week leading up to Father's Day, I'm angry. What can I do? Go to the park, go volunteer, donate. So it's that specific.
Hmm. I love that. And I love that you put that in there too. And we talk a lot about like, these major holidays. And of course, like these big things are tough to get through sometimes, especially like the holiday season and everything. But sometimes I've noticed like we can almost like psych ourselves up leading up to it and almost like make it worse than it is. Or I've spoken to people and they were like, the day itself actually wasn't that bad. I think I made it worse. Like, so I think I'm a big proponent, and I think your book is a perfect complement to this, of witnessing your grief and giving yourself time to hear it, to see it, to feel it every day. And whether that is 5 or 10 minutes, whether that's a walk, whether it's lighting a candle, or whatever amazing tips that you have in your book to allow that. So whether it's just the small quiet moments during a day, or if it is maybe a bigger milestone or something that's coming up that you're like, oh, I'm kind of dreading this, that there's something for all of that, and in the in-between moments as well, because we know grief does not discriminate depending on the day. Like it's
Absolutely. It's
yeah.
so temperamental. And I love what you said, because that is so true. And I love your word choice, the witness your grief, if you navigate your grief, if you hold space for your grief on the day off, you
Mhm.
don't necessarily have a meltdown because you worked on
Yeah,
yourself. For a
right.
lot of people, when they have like that particular day ends up being really hard, I always remind them, did you shove it under the carpet throughout the year? And on this one day, it just hit you hard, versus just knowing there is that perpetual emptiness. Like the example that I gave of my friend, she was like,
Yes.
I have no anecdotal memory of Christmas because I grew up in a Jewish family. But I said to her, but then Christmas to you represents happy families. With,
Yeah.
commercials remind us of happy families. So it could be any holiday. This happens to be Christmas. So what you're missing out on is community.
It's bigger than that.
Somebody,
Yeah.
a communal thing, somebody doting on you and saying, get that slice of apple pie. Like nobody is going to say that to you. It's something that your parents do, right? And
Yeah.
that's such a simple example of the big things parents do. But that unconditional love, that support, no matter what kids do, that comes from most parents. There are people who have their challenges, and I'm not speaking about them, but
Sure.
most parents try to do the best from where they are. So
Yeah.
I said to my friend, like, that's grief. There is no anecdotal evidence, there is no contextual evidence, but a happy, full family will make you feel less than because there's something empty inside you.
Hmm. Wow. That is so powerful. Oh my God. So much to unpack here. I could seriously talk to you all day about this, and how Ayurveda plays a role in this and how it can be so healing. But I want to just encourage and of course this will all be linked in the show notes, but to get a copy of your book. It sounds like such a beautiful guide. And I love actually what you said about like you could just open to kind of any page or whatever. And I actually love doing that with certain books that are designed that way. I'm like, let's see what the universe is saying that I need today. And I kind of just like, I love to feel just like led in that way. But that's so amazing. So I love to kind of close out episodes once in a while with asking what your interpretation of finding gains from your losses means to you.
It's I completed my doctorate program, wrote this book, and finished a business program in the 1 year leading up to the death anniversary. And so in that 1 year, so to me, the gain was it wasn't even about finding meaning. I
Right,
was
right.
also a cross-continental caregiver. And I
Mm.
was a caregiver out of choice. My dad or my father-in-law never asked me to, but I was there every quarter, working from them, spending time with them. And I'm so glad I did that because now I don't get to. So
Yeah.
the gain in that ways have been like the time, right? In this at the start, I felt like an empty nester. But then
Mm.
when I had that time, because you know what, I'm going to put that time to use. And not because I want to be a productivity junkie, not at all, like in a good way. Whether it's sitting with myself on a given day or working out a little bit extra or, reading or writing. So
Yeah.
that and I have a mentor who'd said this to me, who lost her parents way before I did. She said, you'll have that time and don't feel guilty about being productive about that time.
Mm-hmm.
At the start, it felt like, oh my God, am I rejoicing? And it's like, no, there's no rejoicing. Instead of squandering away the gift that they've left you, that emptiness is there, but the gift is like, what do you want to do next with your life? So
Mm-hmm.
for me, I think I took that as a gift to honor them, but also to honor who I am. Our
Yes.
lives cannot only be about those who have passed away. It's also about ourselves and our loved ones who are still there breathing with us and
Yes.
whatever time we have left. I can't always be about this sadness. Like my parents would be so heartbroken because they knew I just love fun and laughter. And if I just was sad all the time, not doing anything, like they would feel like they failed as parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, beautifully said. And I'm always cautious. I never want to put words in the mouths of loved ones of people who have died. But I would venture to say, I am certainly of the belief that when we die, all of these emotions that we feel here in our human bodies and all of that, the anguish, the literal feelings, the contraction that we can feel with grief and all of that, that doesn't travel with us when we go. I truly feel that there is just it's joy and light and love and peace wherever anyone believes the the other side is. And I'm not here to impose anything like that on anyone today, but I just think that's such a beautiful reminder that, for those of us who have experienced loss too, we know life is sometimes not as long as we would like it to be, life here in the physical world. So I never want to say like, make the most of it, but it's just taking it a moment at a time, a step at a time, doing the next right thing, the next thing that just feels good and just keep doing things that feel good. And I feel like eventually you do discover you're like, wow, I feel good. I feel okay. And not that I'm not going to have my griefy moments and things aren't going to come up or I might get triggered by something. It's the nature of the beast, but there is just there's the light that we've referred to a few times here and the light can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people and I love that. It's kind of open for interpretation and it's whatever that looks and feels like to you. But that's why I just love the, Ayurveda and how you've incorporated all of this into especially the conversation today. And just, I think it's such a beautiful thing to be aware of. So I really encourage people to look into Ayurveda a little bit. And, if there's any other resources that you can share about that and how that might help in the healing journey or just like feeling a bit more like ourselves again after we go through something devastating, I would love for you to share because I think it's just such a beautiful practice.
Absolutely. So, please feel free to visit my website. I have articles, blogs explaining every aspect of Ayurveda, not just that, but also grief, what
Mm.
grief looks like from an Ayurvedic perspective. I've written for several magazines, so there's also that. But the one thing I do want to remind people is sometimes we need to have conversations with grief. At the
Yeah.
start, it'll be very intense, right? And
Hmm.
who am I to define whether it's 1 week or 1 month? But and grief will show up forever. The intensity with which it shows up might decrease over a period of time, but one
Yeah.
trigger but sometimes it's also okay to have that conversations. Like
Hmm.
very recently I said to my like, I get it. They're both gone.
Yeah.
Nothing will bring them back. I
Hmm.
am really drained out today. I cannot do this.
Yeah.
And it took 2 seconds, and it's almost like grief is like that toddler. I want, and then tired.
Yeah.
So and so there'll be a stage in
I
your
love
grieving
that.
journey, where you might be able to have that conversation because grief is so exhausting. Grief is so depleting. It's heavy, it's kapha, and it
Mhm.
just pulls you down. And there are times when you're like, I hear you. I've held space for you, just not today.
Yeah, not right now. I'm
Just
back in
just not
20.
right now. Yeah, just not right now. And because then it's cellular memory, you start making, so you of course are holding space for your grief, but
Yep.
this also starts to become a new memory. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be addressed right away, with an intensity. Like that
Yeah.
absence is always there, but honor that on a daily basis. Like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, did this interview with Tara, I can't tell my dad. And that's a reality. Doesn't mean it has to be a heavy thing. It's a real thing. So
Yes.
notice how the shades of grief also change over a period of time.
Yes. Oh, I love that's a beautiful way to end it. I love it. If anybody walks away with anything today, it's just knowing that I love that. That's such a beautiful visual. The shades of grief change and evolve over time. I love that so much. Thank you so much for this conversation today. I think this is such a beautiful and unique perspective to grief that a lot of people here might not be aware of or familiar with yet. And I think it's such a beautiful, just way to approach our grief too. That's can feel very enlightening as well at the end of the day. And it can really open our eyes a lot when we, realize like, okay, this is maybe a little imbalanced, if you will, or, oh, this is why I'm feeling this way, and kind of getting more to the root of it and being curious about that and exploring that. And I know that can hurt. And I know that's not always a fun process, but I think, like you've said, like the more that we can hold that space and get curious and explore that, I'm not gonna say the easier our healing journey is going to be, but the more we will unlock more of these shades of grief, so to speak. And that's,
Okay.
a very transformative process.
Yes, it is. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for having me, Tara. And to
that was
everyone
my
who's
pleasure.
listening to this conversation, may you find peace and happiness eventually in your healing journey. That's
Thank you
my
so
one
much.
wish for everybody.
Yes, I love that so much. And last thing, really quick here, and this is all going to be in the show notes, but where can people find you to connect with you? I know you kind of just mentioned a couple, like your website and a couple
So
resources, but
just
just
go to my
last.
website, which is shwetavikram.com. You can find all the social media links there. It'll be easier that way. Every article, blog that you're looking for. If you want to book a consultation, there's a contact form on there. Just, yeah, I'm active
Yeah,
on
you're around.
social media. Yeah, I'm around and I'm active on social media. I respond to emails because no one should have to go through the grieving process alone. It
Yes.
takes a village to heal. The work has to be your own, but it takes a village.
Yes. Perfectly said. I love it. Thank you so much for this today. I enjoyed this so much. And I know everyone here listening, I have no doubt everyone will feel just a little bit more uplifted today. We're cracking the door open to hope and light and all the beautiful things. So I'm just so grateful for your time today. I am sending you a huge thank you for tuning into today's episode, my friend. I'm so grateful you're here and for the steps you are taking to heal your heart, open your mind, fulfill your soul, learn, grow, and evolve, and move through this crazy thing called life in big, beautiful, impactful ways. Visit lossesbecomegains.com for my blog, ways to work with me, to shop my daily journal, and so much more. And be sure you're following along on Instagram and Facebook at Life with Grief Podcast. I love seeing new faces, meeting new people, hearing your stories, and supporting you however I can. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. If you haven't left a rating or review, please do so. I would so appreciate it. Or if you feel so inclined, to share this episode or this podcast with someone who could use it too. I'll catch you in the next episode.